Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Chats with Chaudhry. I hope you're safe and well. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Jan Lichtenberg, who is CEO and co-founder of Insphero. And he is actually part of a panel which is running at the upcoming SLAS Europe event, which will be in Dublin next week from the 24th to the 27th, which is entitled, in fact, Ecosystems or this ecosystem track. So I thought I'd catch up with Jan and find out a bit more what that track is covering, what are some of the issues they're going to be talking about, and also use this as a bit of a preview for SLAS Europe if you haven't registered already. So for those who are not familiar with SLAS, obviously they're very huge in the States. They've got a massive event which happens every January, I think it's February next year actually. And they've got their live event happening in Dublin, as I say, next week from the 24th to 27th. So yeah, and first of all, it's lovely to meet you. How are you?
Pretty good. Summer in Switzerland, so it couldn't be better.
Well, hopefully the sun is shining. So I was in Vienna yesterday and Paris the day before, and both days it was glorious sunshine. So hopefully it's sunny in Switzerland.
Yeah,
today.
keep fingers crossed.
Fantastic. Now, before we start talking about SLS and the ecosystem track, would you mind giving viewers a very quick background on yourself and the business?
Sure, definitely. So I think in a way I'm a bit of a prototypic SLAS member because I was trained as a technology engineer, microtechnology engineer, working on microfluidics during my PhD, which I did in Switzerland, but then moved very quickly into the life science field, using microfluidics for cell culture, for DNA analysis, for analytical chemistry applications. And during that time, I also got a hack for startups, and I had my first startups, which was in the semiconductor field at the time. Then after that, went to do my postdoc and start industry work. And then it was around 2008, two friends approached me and said, "Hey, we continued that research work that we've done during your postdoc. Would you be interested in starting a company together?" And so we started in Insphero. We were part of SLAS right from the beginning of the society when it started, when it merged from SBS and ALA at the time. And what I always loved about being part of SLAS and going to SLAS meetings is that you have this mix of science and technology, engineer, biologists, chemical chemists, and so on. And so I think this makes things really super exciting. For Insphero, we're 70 people between Switzerland and the US, and our focus is creating 3D cell culture models for pharmaceutical and biotech industries to do discovery and safety testing on highly predictive human tissue models in vitro.
Fantastic. That's really interesting. Now, let's talk about the ecosystem track. So what actually is the ecosystem track and what is it covering?
So that's a really interesting topic that Severine organized and put together a panel of 4 speakers representing very different types of companies. And I think, first of all, the driving idea is the SLAS Europe is the 3rd SLAS conference in Europe. So it's still a fairly young member of the conference circuit in Europe, but I think it addresses a really important market and important business topics. And one of the aspects is, how do you succeed as a life science company in the European ecosystem? How is it different from the US? How is it different from Asia? What are the challenges in Europe? What are the chances that we also have in this part of the world? And so to that end, we have an interesting group of companies, from venture-backed companies to entrepreneurs that have successfully sold their company to a company that made it to NASDAQ, BICO. So I think it's a full spectrum of stories that we have to tell here.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned Severine. So for the viewers who are not familiar with Severine, we should just throw a name out there. So who is Severine? And she's chairing it. And who are the other panelists with you on this particular track?
Yeah. So for those that know SLAS well, Severine Thomas Lousteau, she was a member of the board of directors for SLAS. For many years. She works as a consultant in the life science industry, so she really knows that that zone from companies, growth, venture capital, finding the customer need. I think this is really her home. Then we have Eric Gantenholm. He's the founder and CEO of Bico. Bico is a company that started selling, focusing on 3D bioprinting, and then grew a lot through acquisitions, and did an IPO a couple of years ago. Really big success story. Andrew Lin is on the panel as well, and he started Fluidic Analytics company in the life science space in Mark Trussdale as well. He had a successful exit with this company. So we have a pretty good mix here.
Fantastic. Now, from your perspective, because obviously I don't want to go through the whole track today and talk about everything, but from your perspective, I mean, what are some of the particular challenges that European companies do face, which is different from the rest of the world when it comes to, starting and growing a biotech business?
So, of course, I think it starts with Europe being a more fragmented market than, for instance, the US, right? So we have different countries, different languages, in some cases, different currencies. We have different tax systems. So especially if you start expanding, this, I think, makes things a little bit more complicated. So speaking from our perspective, we are based in Switzerland, which is not even part of the European Union, right? Still, it's smack in the middle of Europe. And this is fantastic. We have great mountains, great lakes. We're close to, I think, everywhere. But when it comes to exporting our products, to ship them just to neighboring Germany, France, or Italy, things are getting a little bit rough. And especially when you are young and the company doesn't yet have that level of operational excellence, then this can be problematic. Right? I think we also see a big difference in funding for startups. I think there is a growing appetite to fund startups in early and seed stages and to Series A, Series B rounds. I think where we're still missing out a little bit is then when the follow-up rounds come, C and D, there are not as many investors capable of bringing capital into these rounds than there is in the US, and so this is where some really successful companies then start wandering off, getting financed by US investors, and very often then also move their kind of their headquarters to the US. And I think if Europe does not want that drain, I think we need to expand on our funding background.
Well, that's one interesting thing that comes to mind, though, is that obviously people say there might be a different mindset in the US to Europe as well. But also within Europe, do you think there are different mindsets based on the different countries? Whether in Switzerland, is there a different mindset to France and so on? And so it's even more fragmented, more difficult because you have different cultural differences. There isn't one pan-European experience or culture, or am I wrong in assuming that?
No, this is a good point. And so there are different approaches to entrepreneurship, right? So in Germany, I think you have a more, let's say, a solid, hey, let's not grow too fast. Let's make sure that everything's top notch before we move this to the next level. I think the UK is already a lot more aggressive. I think we see a lot of great startups coming out of France as well. Again, with a very different approach, right? Being a more centralistic country in terms of the way how it's run from a political level. And then, of course, there is a big difference in terms of non-dilutive funding that you can get. Some countries have extremely well-developed funding systems, which are fantastic for small companies because they can de-risk some of their growth in a non-dilutive way, while other countries, and Switzerland is one of them, just from a legal perspective, cannot give money to startups. And so that creates a substantial change or let's say it's not a level playing field.
Sure.
But then, of course, there are other aspects as well. Density of great universities, access to good scientists, access to support, to kind of collaborate on certain R&D that you need to do to stay on top of things with top-notch academic institutions. And of course, again, we'll have, it's pretty heterogeneous there.
Fine. And obviously you're in an area where new technologies always coming out, and disruptive technologies are coming out to the marketplace. So what are the challenges, particularly in Europe, to bringing disruptive technologies to the market?
So speaking for the life science market, I think what our experience over the past 6-7 years that we are out there with commercial products in this field is that we see, let's say, more appetite to take risk in the US than we see in Europe. So in our case, we are replacing classical 2D cell culture, which has been used for many, many years.
Sure.
Of course, a lot of people have experience with it. Bringing such a new technology, a 3D model, into a company has a lot of opportunities, but also certain risks. And for us, it seems to be easier to find kind of champions in US companies that are willing to take that risk and bring this technology into the company, because they know I'm winning anyway, right? So I'm winning when I do this successfully because I've brought value to the company, and I'm winning if it's a failure for being able to take the risk or being brave to take the risk to do that. And so that is, I think this is a bit of a culture that we need to really bring more into European companies, where sometimes, you think, hey, let's rather not fail than not win. And I think this is something that is not sustainable in growing competitive environment.
Do you think then, and that leads quite nicely to my next question, that do you think that the pandemic has encouraged people and life science in general to take more risk now, because they were very, very conservative pre-pandemic, and the pandemic forced companies, and big pharma in particular, to start to collaborate with people perhaps they never did before? And digitalization is a good example. They brought in more digitalization, having to work remotely, and all those different aspects. So do you think things have changed post-pandemic, hopefully post-pandemic anyway, as we come out of it? Or do you think, it is still pretty much the same as it was pre-pandemic?
No, I think a lot of things have changed during the pandemic and will stay changed, right? Or it's a change that maybe has just started and is continuing. Flexibility in the workspace in terms of home office or on-site, I think, plays a role. Now, looking at this from a laboratory automation perspective, and you mentioned digitalization, we'll see a lot more robotics in the labs that are able to run experiments while the scientist is not present. So it's not really just about a couple of minutes or half an hour of walk away time, but the capability of running something totally remote for a couple of hours. I think this is definitely something that we're growing, that we'll see more and more. But I also believe that especially large pharmaceutical companies that have reacted very swiftly, but also very severely when the pandemic hit and closed a lot of labs and sent people home, and they were, especially when it came to practical lab work, which is what my company does, they were pretty much paralyzed. And I think many of these companies were happy that smaller organizations like ours was able to maintain full operability during the pandemic. And sure. I think an understanding that centralization in a large central lab or with a large central CRO, for instance, has its advantages. It also has its disadvantages when a catastrophic situation like that hits. And to work in a more decentralized fashion, managing the interfaces between the different players then will become more and more relevant.
Right. And coming back to your point about risk, though, and the difference between the US and Europe, do you think then that, well, I suppose my question would be, how can you change the mindset in Europe and entrepreneurs in Europe to be less risk averse? Because, how can you go about that? Is that just through, things like the track we're running at SLAS next week, or is it case studies, or is it training, or how do you do that?
Mhm.
How do you manage to change people to become less risk averse as entrepreneurs
Mhm.
within the life science field?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we need to develop a little bit more is the failure, our failure culture in Europe, which I think is quite underdeveloped compared to the US. And we still, I think, see failures primarily as something bad, right? And I'm not trying to sugarcoat things. Of course, it's bad if you fail, but you also learn something, in the learning experience, and the way how you come out of this, how you stand up again and then keep walking. I think that makes a big difference. And I remember I talked to a venture capital investor in the US, a fairly large company, and the partner in that company, he said, "Hey, I really love your company. I love your business plan. I see how you do things. The reason why I'm not going to invest into your company is you never failed. And I'm only investing into entrepreneurs that failed once and got up again and learned from the mistakes." So, for me, kind of still collateral damage. There was not much that I could do about it. But I just, on the flight home, I thought a lot about it, and I see that, right. So making a mistake and then not shying away from continuing, but learning and adjusting and but not losing that energy. I think that's what every country needs, and I think we have some catching up to do.
Right. And my final question really is maybe leading on from that, and also what we're talking about, how things are different post-pandemic, is what advice would be giving to new businesses now post-pandemic in terms of when they're starting up and trying to launch new businesses in life science?
Mm-hmm. So I think the thing is, unfortunately, post-pandemic kind of merged directly with in war, and also with very difficult life science stock markets, right? A lot of stocks are plummeting, which again makes investors a lot more careful investing. So some will be sitting on the fences as things change, or waiting for things to change. But the situation was not so different when we started Insphero. So we registered the company in 2009. We became operational in 2010. So this was in the middle of the financial crisis. And a lot of people said, "Hey, you guys are stupid. Why would you give up your well-paid jobs? You should be happy that you have one, instead of going off on that crazy track to start a company." But it was the right time. It was not the right time because of the financial crash in these years, but it was the right time for us in our technology to mature it, and we knew it, right? And so we said we do it anyway. And it wasn't easy to do fundraising in 2010. It was fairly easy to buy used life science equipment because so many companies had to close and sold off stuff. But that created a certain humbleness for us, but at the same time, a certain willingness to succeed. So I think my advice is, just because we live in kind of bleak times when it comes to investments in the life science space, doesn't mean that you need to put your ideas on hold. You can still succeed independent of what the surroundings are.
Fantastic. Well, look, Jan, thank you very much for that. Now, viewers, I hope you found that interesting, because I genuinely found that really interesting, listening to Jan talk about the challenges within the life science space. So if you are at SLAS next week, then make sure you attend the track, which is running. And if you haven't registered yet, you can still do that, because the link will be above the video, so you can register for SLAS Europe for next week. Jan, I really appreciate taking time out to share some of your thoughts in this particular area. It really is interesting. I love listening to it. I could talk for hours about this. So thank you very much for sharing that information.
Thanks a lot for taking time, Rizwan.
No, that's excellent. And good luck with the talk and the panel discussion next week. I'm sure it'll be
and then see you next week.
I will be there certainly on the Thursday. So thank you very much. So there you go, viewers.
Perfect.
If you haven't signed up for SLAS yet, check out the link above the video and sign up for SLAS Europe, and sign up for the track as well that Jan is part of. And until next time, as always, stay well and stay safe. Bye-bye. Now stay on the